Oh, sì, va bene. Ma alle... Che ora è?
Sì, sì. È l'ora romana, non si inizia prima delle 5:30, no? Ma ogni tempo, qualsiasi tempo dopo. Vabbè. Quindi la parola al direttore del centro San Luigi dei francesi, ecco, che dice 2 parole per introdurre la nostra conferenza, professore Römer. Prego.
Grazie professore. 2 parole in francese, se va bene per tutti in francese? Ça va? En inglese o in italiano. Donc je présente simplement rapidement le professeur Thomas Römer que vous connaissez mieux que moi. Donc je vais faire court, parce que sinon vous allez vous ennuyer. Et donc je passerai sur vos études et tout ce que vous avez fait. Je me rappelle juste un moment important, je crois, quand vous avez été élu au Collège de France en 2009, comme titulaire de la chaire Milieux Bibliques. C'était la première fois, comme vous disiez dans votre leçon inaugurale, à faire vous êtes le premier à faire explicitement référence à ce texte sacré dans l'intitulé de votre cours. Et comme vous le savez peut-être, en France, avec sa laïcité différente, pouvoir parler au Collège de France de Bible, c'était quelque chose d'exceptionnel. Et puis, j'ai noté un autre moment important aussi, c'est tout votre travail que vous connaissez parfaitement sur le Pentateuque. En particulier, je relisais cet après-midi un texte sur la fille de Jephthé que vous aviez fait. Et donc tout ce cadre qui anime les universités pontificales, mais sur lequel aujourd'hui il y a un travail serein entre l'exégèse et l'approfondissement de la connaissance, et parfois une théologie qui permette de retomber sur ses pieds, si je puis me permettre. Vous parlerez aujourd'hui, alors j'ai traduit en français votre titre, du sacrifice du Fils ou des Fils, si ça va en français, avec un point d'interrogation, en reprenant le texte de la Genèse 22, et la question du sacrifice des enfants dans l'Israël ancien, question qui concerne l'Israël ancien, mais me semble-t-il aussi un petit peu la région, si je ne me trompe pas. Et je vous laisse la parole, je vous souhaite une bonne conférence et vous remercie d'être venu.
Grazie tante, ecco la parola al professore Römer, che molti conoscono bene, è già venuto più volte qua e anche ha contribuito alla nostra discussione sulle tesi stamattina. Ecco la parola.
Grazie mille. Is the mic working? You understand? Yeah? Okay. So yes, for some of you it's a little bit a boring lesson because you had the paper already to read and to discuss this morning. So I added some special things which are not in the paper, and I hope you will find some interest in what I will present to you. How long should I speak? 45 minutes. Okay. Okay. So let me start with a question about Abraham in general before we come to the question of the sacrifice. the current geopolitical situation in the ancient Near East, or not in the ancient, in the modern Near East, may remind many of our contemporaries of the importance of Abraham. You know, there was the accord, the Abrahamic Accords that were pushed forward by the Americans, and that were broken, of course, after all what happened in October 7th. So, but why did they choose this expression of the Abrahamic Accords? I think this is related to the fact that Abraham, as you know when you read the book of Genesis, of course he's the father of Isaac, but he's also the father of Ishmael, and even more. So many people forget that Abraham had a third wife, if you can say it like this, in Genesis 25 after the passing away of Sarah. He marries Keturah, which means just incense, and with her he has 6 sons, which are all Arabic tribe along the incense traffic. So Ismail also, like Jacob later, will become the father of 12 Arabic tribes. So there's a very, very close link in the figure of Abraham between the Judeite, Israelite descendants of Isaac, Jacob, and of course then all these Arabic tribes. And I think sometimes it's a little bit forgotten today, and it's also forgotten maybe a little bit in the story of the sacrifice, because as we will see in a moment, when it comes to the order of the sacrifice, God is asking him to offer his unique son, Echad in Hebrew, which is a little bit strange because before there is already Ismail. So how to explain this? We will see this in a moment. So as I said already, Genesis 22 is maybe one of the strangest texts in the book of Genesis, for some people even in the whole Bible. It was a whole debate about this text, how to understand and to legitimate or not this text. So I just remember this very famous controversy. It's not really a direct controversy, but two very opposite positions which we have in the standpoint, the viewpoint of Immanuel Kant in The Spirit of Enlightenment, where he uses this text to say, one cannot always know when God is speaking to you, but you may know when God is not speaking to you. And for him, the text of Genesis 22 was the example that this cannot God, who asks for a sacrifice which is totally contrary to all ethical standards. On the other hand, Kierkegaard, in Fear and Trembling, considered this text as the best example what true faith is about, namely that Abraham can suspend ethical requirements. The real faith is not related to ethical standards, it's a direct and absolute obedience to God. So I think this is a controversy which is still going on in a way if it comes to discussion about this text. So people would say, this is really awful, how God can ask something like this to Abraham, and other people would say, but this is, and also the Islamic tradition goes in this way, this is a way that shows how strong the faith of Abraham is, because he has no consideration for whatsoever will be the consequences of the divine order. And of course some people would say this is a clear example of religious fanaticism. And today what's going on, I think this is really an interesting story. So do you know the text? Shall I read it, or we can skip the translation maybe? Oh? Okay. We can skip, so I have a little bit more time. I had a translation from my own, but I think it's, you know the story. So I will come directly to the question how Genesis 22 is related to the question of human sacrifices. As it comes to the understanding of this text in so-called historical critical exegesis, there are different standpoints, of course, viewpoints. And Gunkel, for instance, Gunkel is really the father of many many ideas. I think the Genesis commentary of Gunkler, I say this just in brackets, I think this is still something worth to read because he has many, many interesting observations. Of course, he has also his own theological convictions. And for him, it was a text that conserved a very archaic memory from the passage from human to animal sacrifices. But this was, of course, for him an ancient pre-Israelite legend that was adapted later. And of course, when it was adapted, there was no human sacrifice at all. And then on the other hand, you have a much more theological reading, Gerhard von Rath already, Konrad Schmid and many others, which reads this as a theological narrative and say it has nothing to do with human sacrifices in ancient Israel. They did not exist. It's just a theological story about the fact that the events in 587 after the destruction of the temple put into question the future of the people, and what happens with this divine order is a reflection of can we have a future or not. And of course, since there is a sort of a happy end, there is future for the people. I think this is my Swiss influence. We should have a compromise between the two. Between the two options. I think there is something about human sacrifice, and this is not something archaic, but this is maybe related to the present of the readers or to the listeners of the story. And on the other hand, of course, it's also a theological narrative. So what kind of evidence do we have for human sacrifices? First in the Hebrew Bible. First in the Hebrew Bible we have this idea of the sacrifices of the firstborn. There we have several texts in the so-called covenant code and also outside. For instance, Exodus 22, you shall give me the firstborn of your sons, you shall do the same for the ox and your sheep, and on the 8 days you shall give him to me. It's interesting, the 8 days, so we spoke this morning, maybe there is a link to the circumcision order in Genesis 17, but that's another question. Here it's clearly the firstborn, the human firstborn are also to be offered to Yahweh. The question is, was this really something that happened in every day, or is this something which is an idea of the law? Because the next law in Exodus 13:12 and 34 say, you shall bring to Yahweh every one that opens a womb, every human firstborn among your son you shall redeem. You shall substitute, you shall redeem it with money or with an animal. So we have already the substitution, and I think it's not necessary to postulate an evolution from the first law to the second. I think these two laws can live together, and the idea is there is a theory, and then the practice is for the human firstborn you may substitute. And that these firstborn sacrifices were practiced can be seen also on the contrary, in a certain way, by the critique of the prophets about these kind of sacrifices, because in Micah 6 you have this idea, will Yahweh be pleased with 1,000 of rams, with 10,000 of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? Etc., etc. So the idea is, of course, this is a prophetic perspective. When there is no link with ethical behavior, the best sacrifices will not be enough. And it's interesting that here again he is speaking of the sacrifice of the firstborn. So maybe it's not just theoretical, but that these sacrifices were part, apparently, of the official Yahwist cult, at least the idea. And so, as I said, there's no clear evolution. Then if we go to the archaeological evidence, we have, especially in Salambo, in Phoenicia, but also in Malta, in Sicily, we have these Phoenician colonies where we have cemeteries in which we have bones from children and from animals. So these are mixed together, and so this could be understood as sacrifice, because there is a Punic inscription from Malta from the 6th century BCE, steal of an offering in place of an infant, which is interesting because here again you have this idea of substitution. That there are human sacrifices may be also deducted from a text in Ezekiel 20, which is a very, very strange text, because this is the only text in the Hebrew Bible where Yahweh, or the prophet who speaks in the name of Yahweh, is arguing that he gave laws to the people that were no good, which is very, very strange. All the laws are considered, especially in the book of Ezekiel, the laws are something that if you keep them, you can live with them. And here it is said that Yahweh gave bad laws to the people. And if you follow the things, the bad laws is, I defiled them with the offering when they made everyone who opened the womb pass through the fire, maybe. So we have a similar expression in Ezekiel 20 and in Exodus 13. So then let us come to the sacrifices for Molech. There are several texts in the Hebrew Bible. This is from the film of Metropolis. I don't know if you know this movie from Fritz Lang, a very, very important movie also for biblical scholars, I would say, by the way, because he's inspiring very much from biblical anthropology and biblical context. So if you got the chance to watch this movie on whatever support, I would strongly recommend it. And he has this idea of Moloch, who's swallowing in the fire all the workers who are exploited in this movie. So there are several texts. I don't want to read them. Leviticus 18, 20, 2 Kings 23, Jeremiah 32, who speak about this sacrifice for Molech. And the question, which was never really resolved and maybe will remain unresolved, also I have an idea about it, is who is this Molech? Is this a pagan deity? This is a normal idea. It's a pagan deity. There were all kinds of suggestions that were made about the identity of this Molech, Malikum, Milkum, Baal, Adad Milki. Some people would argue it was not a divinity, it was not a deity, it was a term for the sacrifice, because in the inscription I just showed you, in the Punic inscription, Molech is apparently a sacrificial term designating child sacrifice. But if you look to the biblical text, it's difficult to understand the expression in this way. So I think it's a deity, and then the question arises, who is this deity? There were never any agreement about the identification, and that's why I would suggest that Molech is just Yahweh. Why? Why? Yes. Why is it so? Because we know that the Masoret, if they disliked something, I skipped a slide about the Tafet and the Tofet. There is a place in which apparently these sacrifices take place, which is criticized in the book of Jeremiah. It's called Tofet, and the vocalization is O-E, like Boshet. And the Masorets, if they disliked something very, very much, they changed the vocalization. For instance, for the sons of Saul, which one is called Ishbaal, he becomes, in the book of Samuel, Ishboshet, the man of, what is Boshet, shame or something very depreciative. And so if we just keep the consonants, MLK, we think, of course, of Melech. And there is the fact that Yahweh is often called in the Psalms, in other texts, more than 50 times Yahweh Melech, Yahweh the King. And so the idea is that maybe originally so sacrifices were offered to Yahweh as Yahweh Melech. And there is still an interesting hint on that. This is for the people who do some Greek. In Leviticus 18, these sacrifices are forbidden. But it's said you don't do sacrifices to Molech in the Hebrew Masoretic text, And if you look to the text in the Greek, in the Septuagint, you shall not give your seed to serve a achonti. Achon is a ruler, so it's more translation of Melech than simply the transliteration of Molech. So it's interesting, maybe here the text was not vocalized, and the translator understood this as designing Melech. So, so even in the Hebrew text, you shall not pass over one of your children to Melech or to Molech, and you shall not profane the name of your God. If it's Yahweh speaking, so profanation of the name of Yahweh, what would it be? It would designate or indicate that Melech is in fact Yahweh. What is the meaning of this sacrifice to Yahweh Melech? That is apparently a sacrifice that was carried out by burning. Lipinski, which some of you may know, he was a specialist of the Arameans, the Phoenicians, and he argued, in fact, that this was a ritual birth control that would allow the elimination through sacrifice of unwanted children, those who were born with several handicaps. So it would be kind of, birth control, which in my view is a little bit anachronistic. It's anachronistic in the sense that for a sacrifice you cannot offer something which have a defect. So I think it's a nice idea, but it's not working. I think we come more to the point when we look in the story of Mesha's sacrifice in 2 Kings 3. That is a very interesting story that has escaped censorship because we have this strange story that the Moabite king Mesha was attacked by a whole coalition from Judahites, Edomites, and Israelites, and so he was in a very difficult situation. So the story goes, when the king saw that the battle was lost to him, he took his firstborn son, who was to rule in his place, and offered him as a olah, a burnt offering on the wall. There was a great wrath upon Israel, and they fled from him and returned to the land. What does it show? It shows that sacrifices is working, because the coalition has to retire. So the question is, who was the anger? The wrath was the wrath of Yahweh or the wrath of Chemosh? So later rabbis would say the people were so disgusted that they went away, but maybe this was the wrath of Chemosh against the coalition of the Judahite and the Israel, and so Mesha was saved in this fact. And if you look to the biblical context that speak about this expression, he made his son pass through fire, it also often occurs in context of military crisis, a little bit as we have in 2 Kings 3. So there is some similarities. So maybe we have to do with sacrifices, very rare sacrifices, but intended to invoke the intervention of the deity in situation of great military dangers. Later, when it came to the idea that these sacrifices has to be abolished, you have several strategies. You can just forbid them, as we have it in Deuteronomy 18:10 or Leviticus 18:21 that I quoted already. These are texts from the Persian period that say we should stop with that, or you should stop with it. But apparently the idea that Yahweh himself has demanded sacrifices was very popular in a way, and so you need to invent other strategies. One strategy was just to say, yeah, okay, this is a law from Yahweh, but this is a bad law that was given to you to punish you. Or, and I think this is one of the points of Genesis 22, Genesis 22 is a kind also of a pedagogic way to tell that this is the end of sacrifices, because, okay, there was one sacrifice, but this was a test. And this test then resulted in the substitution of the human sacrifice into an animal sacrifice. First of all, we have to see that this is the only account, Genesis 22, in the whole Abraham narrative in which the patriarch is offering a sacrifice. He builds altars, but on these altars he never offers any sacrifices. So there is something special in this text. I don't have the time now to discuss. We did this morning for those who were there. The question, where is Moriah? Is this Jerusalem? Is this another place? Is this just the mountain of God, where you can imagine whatever you want? So this is very important. This is the only text where a sacrifice actually happens. So the patriarchs are not very keen in offering sacrifices. They're more, I don't know what is. They can build, they can name places, they can build altars, but they don't offer so many sacrifices, even for Jacob, I think. So it's 46, yeah, 46. But this is, yeah, this is apparently a latex. Anyhow, we don't want to go into discussion. It's my fault. So it's very interesting also to see that the story and the names, the divine name in the stories are important, because the story starts, it came to pass after the things that Ha Elohim did tempt Abraham. It's Ha Elohim, it's not just Elohim. Traditionally, this was always regarded as an Elohistic text, maybe with some legitimation, but it's interesting that we have Ha Elohim, which will later become Elohim, and which at the end will become Yahweh. So Ha Elohim, I don't know how to translate it. The deity, the divinity, it's an expression that we can find elsewhere, but which is very much concentrated in the book of Koheleth. Koheleth often speaks about Ha Elohim, and this is a God who's not always easy to understand. Men are on earth and Ha Elohim is in heaven, and it's a little bit what Luther will call later the Deus absconditus, the God who has no clear identity, if I can say. So this is the first strange thing. The other strange thing is what I just told you already. Genesis 22 starts with, take your son, your only son, the one you love, and bring him there as a burnt offering. And there's a very nice rabbinic dialogue, which you can find in the Babylonian Talmud, to explain this insistence. And so, of course, to the rabbis, it goes like this. God says, take your son. Abraham said, which one? I have two. Your only son, one is unique to his mother and the other is unique to his. The one you love, I love this one and I love that one. So Isaac. So it's for all of the qualification, your only one, your son, your only one, the one you love, Isaac. So it's the idea that Abraham is defending that he has two sons and both are important enough for him. Of course, if you look to the story now in Genesis, there is a story just before, which is about the expulsion of Hagar and Isaac. And this story was written in preparation of Genesis 22. We don't have the time now to read the story. You know that story. What is interesting here, just to say that this is really a parallel story, a very parallel story in the sense that in both cases, Ismail's as Isaac's life is threatened, in 21 by Sarah, who said to send them away, and in 22 by God. But in both cases, God gives a command to which Abraham finally obeys. This is a little difference, because in Genesis 21, first of all, Abraham is not happy with this order that comes from his wife, and God said, no, you do whatever she tells you. And then we have parallels, because in both cases, the life of the boy is saved by divine intervention, the angel that is speaking from heaven, and which indicates to Abraham not to sacrifice his son, and to Hagar where is water that the son can live. And in both cases, the son will live in the story, but will remain separated from the father. So Ismail and Isaac will not see anymore Abraham until the death of Abraham, when they both gather in order to bury his father. Let me also just say that maybe one of the reasons why this is such an intriguing narrative is that we don't get any information about the feelings of Abraham or the feelings of Isaac. We just are told what they do, there's a discussion, but we don't know. Was Abraham willing to do this, or was he thinking God cannot ask this and at the end he will change his mind? We don't know. And we discussed this already this morning, so I don't want to quote the whole quotation from Auerbach, Mimesis, a very important text where he compares Genesis 22 with the Odyssey in book 19, where he says it's totally different. In book 19, everything is precise, it's described, all the sentiments of the protagonist, the author is saying what they were thinking, how they were feeling, and in Genesis 22 it's just the opposite. And so I think this is important also if we want to understand. So a way to get out of the problem is to say that the whole story was just a story of a misunderstanding of Abraham. This is Jewish tradition, which is already attested in Genesis Rabbah. And there are different ways, because the order to bring up the son there as a olah, you can explain, or the rabbis explained it differently. First of all, this is something you have already in the book of Jubilee with Mastema who's coming, and then the Satan who is stopping Abraham and say, you cannot do such a sacrifice. It's against the law. It's against the law. So he's quoting from Genesis 9. The man who sheds the blood of a man, by a man shall his blood be shed. So be careful what you're doing, Abraham. And then there's another tradition which is brought forward, which becomes very popular by Rashi. This is the idea that God, in fact, has only said, bring him up as an upbringing. He has never said, because if you read Allah le'olah, you can understand it, bring him up as an upbringing. It's the root Allah. And so the idea is that Abraham did not understand the order. God wanted only that he presented himself his son, and that was it, which is a very sympathetic reading of the whole thing. But of course, it's not really working, because in all other texts of the Bible, Allah le'olah means always bring Holocaust offering. So, and this would be very interesting, very intriguing if this would be the only thing, the only text in the whole Bible that would not work in this sense. So we spoke already about the gaps or the ambiguities, and that starts already when Abraham says to the two Na'arim, the two boys who are with him. And that's also very interesting, because Isaac and the two boys are called Na'arim, so young boys, lads in the puberty, in the age of 15, 16 maybe. And so he says to them, you wait here, we will go there, we will bow down, and then we come back to you. So, what is he doing here, Abraham? Is he lying? Or is he convinced in his inner self that God will not really admit such a sacrifice? Is it just to calm down everybody? So we don't know. We don't know. And second is the victim for the sacrifice. When Isaac said to his father, here we have the fire, we have the wood, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham then is saying, God himself, Elohim, will himself, here we are Elohim and Taha Elohim, God himself will see or provide the lamb for the Ola, my son. So this again you can understand in different ways. You can think that he's saying, don't worry, God will bring a lamb. But you can also understand it in the Hebrew, God will see the lamb for the sacrifice. That's you, my son. So double point, the lamb or the victim of the sacrifice, that's you. Again, we don't know. And another particularity maybe that should be pointed out is that normally if you take the rituals of Leviticus, the victim is immolated before it's put on the altar. So Leviticus never tells about the immolation of the victim. So the victim apparently are killed before they are put on the altar. And here it's just the other way around. And this is, of course, for reasons that you can understand, that this very, very important moment is kept until the very, very end, which is then prevented by this idea of the substitution that comes, and the angel of Yahweh called him from heaven. Now we have the angel of Yahweh, so we have Ha Elohim, Elohim, and Yahweh. But it shows you already that it's a late story, because God is not really intervening directly. He has an angel, he has a mediator who's speaking to him. And so what has always puzzled, and Jean-Louis has a nice article on that, is this question, now I know that you fear, that you fear God. Why did God not know before that Abraham was fearing God? This was a whole theological problem. I know this has divided a theological debate. Really, God didn't know before? So this is, of course, a question for today's theologian, but it's already in the Jubilees, it's changed, because instead of I know, Jubilees would say I make known. But this, I think, is a problem. This exists for later interpretation, but I think for the story, it's part of the test. So in the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh can test just to see what's going on. It's a little bit what's happening also in Job. So we have to admit it, even if we don't like it. But we have those texts where Yahweh is testing. But this is also part of the human freedom, if you want. So if God knows everything before, we are just a marionette. So I think it's important that God knows not always everything. And there are several texts who are in this story. And then it's the fear of God. What is the fear of God here? I think it's something which is quite similar to the book of Koheles, because you can have fear of God in a very active way. If you look on the story of the midwives in Exodus 1:15-20, they disobey the order of Pharaoh to kill all the Hebrew males, firstborn, and what they are doing is called the fear of God. They feared Elohim, but here I think we have a different meaning of the fear of God. Here the fear of God is really the acceptance that God acts as he acts. And so finally it comes to the substitution. The sacrifice takes place instead of Isaac. The command of God who wanted Olah is now fulfilled, because you have exactly the same expression from the order that is now fulfilled with the animal. So there are in the you can have parallels for this motive of substitution. Also in the Greek tradition, this is the myth of Atamas. I don't know if you're familiar with this, and I would like to thank one of the students I don't see here, who pointed out to me that there were 2 errors in my slide that I corrected me right. So it's interesting, because there also the king Atamas becomes, of course, it's different because there are different deities who are interacting. He becomes a victim of Ino, the deity Ino, who makes him understand that he must sacrifice his son, Phrixus, and he brings him to a mountain also, and he wants to kill him. a little bit like in Genesis, and then Nephele sends a flying golden ram, so it's flying, it's not like in the Bible that's stuck in the wood, and with this ram they can escape, and so he loses his sister. I don't tell the whole story, and then in Colchis he will sacrifice the ram to Zeus, who will place it in the heavens as a constellation. So it's not exactly the same, but you have this idea of sacrifice and a substitution for the sacrifice. For the sacrifice itself, for the human sacrifice itself, we have in the Hebrew Bible very interesting other text, that is the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter in the book of Judges. So I don't want to go with all with you with all the diachronic problems, but I put the sacrifice story in red, and you can see that it's clearly an insertion in an older text. So in the older Deuteronomistic version there was no sacrifice. It happened in a quite late insertion, and it's possible, I think it's possible, that the author of the story was inspired by Genesis 22, because in Genesis 22 and in Judges 1 we have several parallels. A father is required to offer his child, his unique child, as a burnt offering. The verb to see is very important in both passages. God will see the sacrificial victim, and Jephthah sees his daughter, who then becomes the victim, because you remember the story. He made this vow: what I see first coming on my way, I will sacrifice it. And the difference, of course, is the end. The end is that the sacrifice takes clearly place in the Jephthah daughter. So this is a tragic ending, and maybe inspired by the Iphigenia story from Euripides. There, I checked a little bit with the scholars on Iphigenia. There's also a whole debate, because, as you may know, there are two stories, Iphigenia in Tauris and Iphigenia at Aulis. And some scholars are arguing that in the original version, so I'm very happy to see that Greek scholars, also Greek mythology scholars, also do some diachrony, because they think that the ending of Iphigenia in Taurus was added in order to harmonize both versions, and in the original ending we would have also a substitution by a hint that is brought by Artemias, who takes Iphigenia away to Asia. In any case, I think it's interesting because you have this dialogue also with Greek traditions, and maybe the author of Judges 11 was already familiar with this story. This is another way also, of course, to criticize in a way sacrifices, because here there is really no happy ending. The sacrifice in Judges 11 takes place. But and this brings me almost to the end, is the ending in Genesis 22 really a happy ending? Because as you remember, I read it to you, Abraham was saying to the young man, stay here, we return to you after we bow down. And then we will return in verse 5, and in verse 19, all of a sudden Abraham returned. They could have said Abraham and Isaac returned to the young man. Where was Isaac? I think this one word missing, this Isaac missing, gave rise to all kind of speculation what happened to Isaac. And so recently, Yore, Israeli author, he took up an old idea in Jewish tradition that finally the sacrifice had taken place. So he reconstructs the story as it is. Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to kill his son, and he killed his son. And then the angel God called him from heaven, said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, here I am, he said, now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your own son, your only son, from me. So Abraham returned to his young man, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. So what do you think? Is this working or not? Are you convinced by this? Diachronically, it's working in a way, but the question is whether this was really the idea of the author of Genesis 22. I think that's very difficult to know, of course, but it is interesting that after this story, Isaac and Abraham will never appear together. This prepares the separation. You can see the separation of the father and the son. In Genesis 23, there's no Isaac. It's the story of the of Sarah's death and the buying of the sepulchre in Hebron or Kiryat Arba. And then in 24, Abraham sends out his servant to find a wife for Isaac. And when the servant comes back with Rebekah, there's no Abraham anymore. There's just Isaac. So the two of them, they don't interact anymore together. So if I sum up and then I show you some pictures, and maybe I read a little bit of Woody Allen. So to summarize, I would say we have several texts in the Hebrew Bible that show how nascent Judaism sought to eradicate child sacrifice, but maybe it would be more accurate to say to provide sublimation to these practices. And I would like to recommend this book from John Levinson, which is called The Death and the Resurrection of the Beloved Son. And this is also a little bit related to the discussion we had this morning with the New Testament people, because he said the impulse to sacrifice the firstborn son remained potent long after the literal practice had become odious and fallen into desuetude. And he hinted also on some Christian recuperation of this motive. So before ending, let me just show you some pictures. We discussed a little bit this morning of Rembrandt. Rembrandt was very much obsessed by this story. He painted or represented in a different way. And the first one is that he is instructing his son. So this is also something, there's also a gap in the text, how Isaac knew. It's all silent in Genesis 22. And here we see how Rembrandt is showing how Abraham explaining his son what will happen. And we spoke again. And so as for the angel, it's also very interesting in this very famous picture. The angel is still from heaven, but it's touching already the hand of Abraham. And this goes even more in the last picture, which reminds almost on the fight between Jacob and the angel in Genesis 32. And I would also like to show you Chagall and Dali. Chagall is also very interesting because in the background, I don't know if you, yeah, I think you can see it on the screen, and not so much on this screen. On the background, you see crosses, and you see already this Christian rereading of the Akedah on which Chagall is hinting there. And then if you go to Dali, you see this angel who becomes like a monster, and this very small Abraham who does not know what to do, and he's threatened. So the angel here is more like a threat than a helping personality. So he's threatening there. And I don't know if you know the story Genesis 22 retold by Woody Allen. No? So maybe I can read this and then we can stop. So, Abraham awoke in the middle of the night and said to his only son Isaac, I have had a dream where the voice of the Lord said that I must sacrifice my only son. So put your pants on. And Isaac trembled and said, so what did you say? I mean, when he brought you this whole thing up? What I'm going to say, Abraham said, I'm standing here at 2 a.m. in my underwear with the creator of the universe. Should I argue? Well, did he say why he wants me sacrificed? Isaac asked his father. But Abraham said, "The faithful do not question. Now let's go, because I have a heavy day tomorrow." And Sarah, who heard Abraham's plan, grew vexed and said, "How do you know it was the Lord, and not say, thy friend who loveth practical jokes? For the Lord hates practical jokes, and whoever shall pull one shall be delivered into the hand of its enemies, whether they pay the delivery charge or not." And Abraham answered, "Because I know it was the Lord." It was a deep, resonant voice, well modulated, and nobody in the wilderness can get a rumble in it like that. And Sarah said, "And you are willing to carry out this senseless act?" But Abraham told her, "Frankly, yes. For to question the Lord's words is one of the worst things a person can do, particularly with the economy in the state it is." And so he took Isaac to a certain place and prepared to sacrifice him. But at the last minute, the Lord stayed Abraham's hand and said, "How could you do such a thing?" And Abraham said, "But you said." "Never mind what I said," the Lord spoke. "Do you listen to every crazy idea that comes this way?" And Abraham grew ashamed. "Not really, no. I jokingly suggest you sacrifice Isaac, and you immediately runs out to do it." And Abraham fell to his knees. "See, I never know when you're kidding." And the Lord thundered, "No sense of humor. I can't believe it. But do this not prove that I love you, that I was willing to donate mine only son on thy whim?" And the Lord said, "It proves that some man will follow any order, no matter how as long as it comes from a resonant, well-modulated voice." And with that, the Lord bid Abraham to get some rest and check with him tomorrow. So I think it's a very funny story, but it's also a very profound story, because if you listen to it, there are some way of putting the story that resonates with Kant, that resonates with any other critiques of the story we heard already. So thank you very much for your interest.
So thank you very much for the way you illustrated that famous text that